How far can Ukraine's military go inside Russia? Moscow has come under one of the largest drone attacks of the war, and with the Kyiv government controlling more than 1,000 square kilometres of Kursk region, how will Russia respond? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. When President Vladimir Putin launched Russia's so-called special military operation in Ukraine 2.5 years ago, he expected a speedy victory. Not only did that not happen, but Ukraine has now brought the war home to Russia. The capital has faced one of the biggest ever drone attacks, according to the mayor of Moscow, and Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region caught Russia by surprise. Has Russia's bold and asymmetric move put on hold discussions about a stalemate and possible negotiations involving concessions to Russia? And if so, how will Moscow retaliate? We'll discuss all of this with our guests in a moment, but first this report from Victoria Gatenby.
During a week in which Russia's air defences shot down 45 Ukrainian drones targeting Moscow and its surrounding region, and Ukrainian forces advanced further into the Russian region of Kursk, President Vladimir Putin visited two places that shaped him early on as a leader. In Beslan in North Ossetia, he remembered the victims of a school attack in 2004. Chechen separatists took more than 1,000 people hostage. Putin ordered Russian soldiers to storm the complex and end the siege. Putin says there are parallels between Russia's military action in Beslan and the war in Ukraine.
They continue this work with an attempt to destabilize our country. This is obvious. And just as we fought against terrorists, we now have to fight those who commit crimes in the Kursk region, in Donbass and Novorossiya.
Putin also visited Chechnya for the first time in 13 years. In 1999, as a newly appointed prime minister, he launched a war against Chechen separatist fighters. Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov is a key ally of Moscow.
We have deployed over 47,000 fighters to the area of special military operation, including about 19,000 volunteers. We have a reserve of several dozen trained and equipped fighters ready to leave at your first order.
Ukrainian forces are continuing their push into the Kursk region with airstrikes on Russian military positions and equipment.
Our operation in the Kursk region, our combat work continues. Steps are being taken. We control the designated areas.
But as Ukrainian troops advance, Russian forces are moving closer to the key logistics hub of Pokrovsk in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk.
We must fight in the Donbass and show our courage. The strategy must be to defend our country in the Donbass. That's the first priority. Only then we could do something like this in the Kursk region.
With Pokrovsk such an important prize for Russia, fighting is set to intensify in the coming days. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Time now to bring in our guests, three experts who know more about this, much more about this than me. In Taipei, we have Hanna Shelest, the Programme Director of Security Studies at Ukrainian Prism, a Ukrainian foreign policy and security think tank. In Brussels, Theresa Fallon is the founder and director of the Centre for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies. And in Rome, Owen Matthews, author of Overreach, a book about the origins of the war in Ukraine. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today on Inside Story. Theresa, let me start with you in Brussels. When you heard first, on August the 6th, about this surprise, daring raid by Ukraine into Russia, did you think at the time that more than 2 weeks on, there would still be sizable numbers of Ukrainian troops holding territory inside Russia?
Well, indeed, it was an incredibly bold move. And I think even the Ukrainians themselves were surprised at how fast and how far they could penetrate Russian territory. So I think that the Russians have been very slow to move on this. And it's been a shock, I think, to everybody and a welcome surprise.
Hanna, you're there in Taipei. I bet there are some people there who want to mine your experience as a Ukrainian and how to deal with being under attack by Russia for so long. The question to you is the element of surprise here. First foreign invasion of Russia since World War II. How humiliating is this for Putin?
First of all, that is not first invasion. If we remember the 1960s, China did it. So for Russia, it's just that they prefer to forget the bad pages of their history. But definitely the surprise effect, that was very important. But we should not overestimate surprise itself. As we know now, there were a lot of intelligence information that been delivered to Moscow. However, in Moscow, they didn't want to believe that, first of all, Ukraine would decide to act at the Russian territory. And the second, they hoped that our Western partners, first of all, the United States, will prevent us from doing this. Because if you remember, just within the last 2 months, there were 2 other plans that were at the very last moment stopped by our Washington partners. That's why that is less surprise, but more of the miscalculations from the side of the Russian leadership.
Owen, the anniversary is nearly upon us, or about upon us, of the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who died in that suspicious plane crash a year ago. Of course, he had a rebellion on June the 24th of last year, and that, everyone thought, was damaging for Putin. That, of course, only lasted 1 day, and this has now gone on for more than 2 weeks.
Yes, it is remarkable. And I think it's important to actually see the Kursk incursion as part of a triple whammy, because, as you mentioned, it's not just the occupation, which has gone on for a very long time, of that part of Kursk. It's also, we're talking about the drone attack on Moscow. And also, we shouldn't forget that there's been a major attack on a giant gasoline storage facility just near Rostov, which is still burning on its 5th day and has destroyed up to what some experts describe as $200 million worth of refined oil products in Rostov. Today, there's been extraordinary footage of a strike on an airfield, which has been devastating, apparently, and in Mariinovka in Volgograd. And yesterday there was a strike on the Alenia airfield, where strategic bombers fly from, up in Murmansk on the Arctic Sea. So actually, it's not just Kursk; it's the fact that the Ukrainian long-range drones have actually been wreaking devastation all across Russia, and that indeed is unignorable, and I think, in one level, humiliating for Putin. The question is really whether this will damage Putin's political standing, or whether it will strengthen Russians' resolve to resist. Because I can tell you definitively, having spent a lot of time listening to Russian media on the social media, such as Telegram, all Russians, from policymakers to the propagandists to ordinary people, are convinced that this attack has got nothing to do with Ukraine, that it is a NATO-organized attack on the Russian homeland.
Very interesting. Theresa, it's worth recalling 2.5 years ago, when Putin invaded Ukraine, one of the reasons, he said, was a defensive reason. It was to protect Russia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now he's lost a substantial amount of territory, and more than 130,000 Russians have been displaced. Putin doesn't like looking weak, but he does, doesn't he?
And he was also supposed to take Kiev in 3 days. So as we've seen that this war has been a Pandora's box for Russia, it's the first time, as the package noted, that Russia has been invaded. So I think that with Putin's recent visits to Chechnya, for example, and the attack on the horrendous attack in the past on the school, he might be trying to reframe it as terrorism, and that all Russians, this is a terrorist attack rather than a sovereign country invading Russia. But I think that what's really interesting about this whole event in regard to the pushback, right? The US is very absorbed with their domestic elections, and Zelenskyy kind of learned a lesson, in my view, from Israel. Like, they just went ahead. They didn't brief the US. They just acted. And then afterwards, what can they say? They can't really reprimand them because it is a war, and it has proven successful. So I think that this has been a bold move, and it's put it back on the agenda. And we also have to remember that the G7 is trying to negotiate how to use some Russian frozen funds to fund Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. And if there's a change in the US administration, this might be harder to get through. So it's important for the Ukrainians to show that they can win and that they, it's not winning necessarily, but they have these bold moves that they're actually, being able to exchange prisoners. How long will they hold the territory? Will they move back to the border region? All of these things remain to be seen. But I think that it has really captured the public's attention, how Russia, which is actually really moving slowly on all of this, they do have manpower issues. And I think that they're a bit skeptical. They're wondering, Ukraine usually does a 1-2 punch. They're wondering where the next move is for the Ukrainians. So they're kind of slowly watching to see what the next move is. So how Russia will respond has been much slower than most people have expected. But I think they're trying to anticipate what Ukraine will do next. And they don't want to be fooled and be, brought into this kind of Ukrainian trap.
Hanna, take that point on. What is Ukraine going to do next? Currently, we're seeing they're consolidating their position. They've blown up bridges. Now they're blowing up pontoon bridges that Russia put in place. What do you think is going on the ground right now? What do you think Ukraine's trying to achieve?
We definitely don't know the full plan, otherwise we would lose it. But for what is already understandable, there were three main goals from the military point of view. First is to drag some Russian forces from the Eastern Front, where the situation was quite bad for Ukraine the last months. Here we have not seen a serious moves yet, just a few thousand people, Russian soldiers being moved. And that's also a very good characteristic that they are aiming to stay as much as possible on the east where they are winning. And because of this, they brought a lot of the conscripts, so just 18 years old boys who had maximum 1 month of the rifle experience, not even of any shooting, to protect the border. However, the second very important reason for this operation was to create a buffer zone on the north. And this buffer zone had two aims. First of all, is to prevent Russian from attacking Sumy region. What we had just a few months ago, the attempt to attack Kharkiv region, that initially was successful for Russians, then pushed back. But Russians been planning the same for Sumy region. And now with this 40-50 kilometer zone, it is possible to control, to defend it much better. And the third is to protect the northern regions from the constant shelling of the short-range missiles, because they were not even daily but hourly attacks for the Sumy and Kharkiv regions with the S-300, with the different other types of the short artillery. And now with pushing Russian forces, that was very good and a little bit safer for those regions. However, luckily, because of the bad reaction of Russians, we received additional benefits. First of all, there is the huge amount of the prisoners of war, mostly conscripts. And as we know previously, Russia was very careful about not sending conscripts to the war because it is a socially difficult question. And the second is quite a number of Kadyrov people. And what we know from the previous prisoners exchange, that one Kadyrov soldier is more valued than 10 Russian soldiers. And they usually exchange either more people or more serious officers for this. So now the negotiations they already started about this. And humiliation of Mr. Putin and how we now see the discontent. Like previously, all Russian propaganda was the same. What Putin's saying, what Medvedev's saying, what Russian military bloggers saying, what Kadyrov people saying, all the same. Now we see extreme dissatisfaction, first of all, of the military bloggers. They openly saying that military command lost, was not prepared. They are in the very big contact with the Chechnya soldiers, Kadyrov soldiers, and that's why Putin is there. And now we see the absolutely different reaction.
Hanna, I'd like to come back to the Chechnya part of it and the views of people in Moscow. But Owen, staying with the ongoing Kursk operation, it seems Ukrainian forces are still making some limited gains. Is your understanding or your view on this that they are actually trying to still push forward, or are they just making gains in a way that they can defend their positions?
Well, I think, James, I think we need to take a step back and actually look at, one thing that is lacking in all of the situation maps that you see on Twitter, on the internet, is a scale. How many kilometers we're talking about. So fundamental to your question is a suggestion there's some sort of equivalence to the Ukrainian incursion into into Russia and that of the Russian advance on the ground into Ukraine. And unfortunately for the Ukrainians, although there is a massive psychological impact, as Hanna rightly said, there's a massive prisoner impact. In terms of the actual territory that Ukraine holds inside Russia, Russia holds approximately 200 times more territory within Ukraine. And the coming fall of Pokrovsk, as is being reported, Pokrovsk is a key transport hub in Donetsk province, which is about to fall to the Russians and essentially cuts off Ukrainian-controlled rump of Donetsk in half. And that's actually much more strategically significant defeat for Ukraine than anything that they're going to gain in Kursk could be a victory. So whether they're moving forward, whether they're moving back, I think it's clear that ultimately Russia enjoys a massive superiority in material and ultimately men. And I think that the surprising part is they haven't got rid of the Ukrainians, managed to expel the Ukrainians more quickly. That's definitely humiliating. It's embarrassing. But I think there's very little doubt that eventually Putin's sense of himself, his political survival, his entire system depends on him being not weak, but in projecting strength, and he's going to kick the Ukrainians out. He has to. So the question is not really the rather wrong-headed, I think, assumption that Ukraine is going to somehow trade land in Kursk for land in Donetsk. I don't think that's the way it's going to go. What we're talking about in the Kursk is a very fundamentally psychological operation, which is done wonders to improve Ukraine morale within Ukraine and also to damage morale inside Russia and undermine the myth of Putin's invincibility. But that's the utility. It's not really anything to do with the ground operations in Kursk itself.
Theresa, you had the point there from Owen about what's going on in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass. Some say that the objective of the Ukrainians was to try and draw troops away from those key areas where they're fighting in Ukraine. Have they pulled their troops back from there? It seems the answer is no.
That's correct. The Russians did not pull troops away. And I think that many armchair generals like John Mearsheimer or Stephen Waltz from Harvard have said that this was a failure from that point of view. Nevertheless, I think that the political gain of morale boosting is very important. So there's 3 levels of warfare, and here the political aspect is very key. But nevertheless, this is a very difficult war for Ukraine, and I think that this move really does help them gain more political support in the future and clear funding issues, because we saw recently in Germany, the far left party has announced that they no longer want to fund Ukraine. So they really have to show that there is some momentum here. And it's been a terrible grinding war of attrition for Ukraine. And I think that it is a bold move. But yes, they are losing in this key area of Donbass. So
yeah, well, let me bring in Hanna on that. Let me bring in Hanna on that. Pokrovsk, I think I've said it wrong, but that town, how vital is that? How close is it to falling? I spoke to one of my Al Jazeera colleagues who's been there, who says after years of defensive preparations, it is a highly fortified garrison, and we may take much tougher battles than we saw in places like Bakhmut. Would you agree with that?
First of all, in terms of value, each village for Ukraine is valued. It's not about territories, it's about our people living at those territories and about those atrocities Russians are doing under occupation. That's why it doesn't matter how big Pokrovsk, Bakhmut or Avdiivka, that is our people and our territories for which the soldiers will fight. But from the strategic point of view, Pokrovsk is important because in case it fails, it opens the road for logistics. So in this case, the protection and defense of this town would be quite serious. At the same time, if you compare what is happening, was it withdrawal of forces or not, in Pokrovsk, currently Russians had the most trained and professional soldiers that they have. And still, what they had in terms of the territories around Pokrovsk or in terms of the successes is very minimal. And in Kursk, as a result, they have only unprepared young boys, plus a little bit of the professional officers. So Russians can have a lot of them manpower in terms of the population, but in terms of the readiness to fight and preparedness of their soldiers, it's absolutely not the same manpower. So just to the numbers of population or even number of the soldiers officially in the armed forces doesn't say anything about their ability to fight. Plus, don't forget from where Russians took the soldiers. For example, they took them from Kaliningrad, and Kaliningrad is the enclave among the NATO countries, and usually Russians thought that they need really protecting it. So strategically, if they took their soldiers from there to defend their southern border, it means just the absolute unpreparedness in terms of the manpower and in terms of the plans for defense of the Russian territory.
Owen, let's look at what's going on in Moscow, which faced a drone attack. Putin, throughout this couple of weeks, seems to be downplaying everything. He's not fired many people, demoted people. There's been no mass call-up. Are you surprised, as someone who's been watching Putin for a very long time, the way he's responded?
He certainly has been downplaying it, but that's actually kind of a crucial thing, which I think Western commentators fail to understand about the whole Russian attitude towards the entire, what they call the special military operation. They're downplaying it. Now, Moscow basically hasn't noticed. Moscow does not feel like the capital of a city that is fighting the biggest war of the 21st century. It's been swept under the carpet consistently, and you might see that you might see a contradiction there between what we hear the Kremlin propagandists on television threatening to nuke London and saying this is about to break into the Third World War, and the fact that the Kremlin is simultaneously downplaying it. But those things are simultaneously true. And I think, Putin is just attempting to pretend that everything is normal. And so far, there has been a major drone attack. Indeed, 45 drones were shot down, according to the mayor of Moscow. But in fact, none of them caused any damage or hit anything. So until that starts to happen, I think Moscow has experienced some drone strikes, some isolated ones. They did actually cause some consternation last year. But let's remember that drone strikes, missile strikes, even heavy bombing did not break the will of Kiev, nor did they break the will of London or Tokyo or Berlin, by the way, maybe say on a much larger scale. So it's not really about the drone strikes, again, rather like the Kursk incursion, have a psychological effect. It's about reminding the Russians that the war actually is real and it could actually threaten them. But on the other hand, so far, Putin seems to be doing a relatively good job of actually pretending that everything is fine and sweeping it under the carpet. And I think until the war actually comes home, either in terms of economic catastrophe or like personal catastrophe to the majority of Russians, I think most of them would continue to just ignore this and enjoy the economic benefits that, for instance, massively increased Russian state military spending has brought to many areas of the country.
Theresa, he's not just downplaying things, he's also going on a tour. Now, President Putin's someone who's rather limited in where he can go these days because of that International Criminal Court arrest warrant, but he's been to Azerbaijan, he's also been to North Ossetia, to Beslan, and that is the place where there was that attack very early on in his presidency, and he's also been to Chechnya, of course, where right at the beginning of his presidency he was responsible for a very brutal victory in a war there. Do you think it's significant, these two places that he's going, which are sort of places that were major challenges in the past?
Yes, but may I just pick up on one point that Owen made? The Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian refineries has turned it, a huge oil-producing country, into a net importer of refined oil. So this is unbelievable that Russia can't even produce enough refined oil for their own industry. They have to import it. So from that point of view, the Ukrainians have really pushed them to the limit, and no one would have expected this even a year ago. So that is a huge win for Ukraine because it's actually hitting at the most important thing, their economic ability to continue the war in Ukraine, because it makes up about 37%
okay,
of the budget.
On Putin's tour, just tell me the significance of these two places.
On Putin's tour, like his Glory Days tour, we remember what he said about the Chechens and how he bombed them back to the Stone Age, what happened in Beslan. It was kind of, this terrorist attack. That's how, and it was horrendous. And also we've had the recent terrorist attack in Moscow at the theater. So I think that he might be trying to reframe this as not a sovereign attack on Russia, but actually a terrorist attack in Kursk area. That would make it more palatable for him. But I don't think Putin cares if he feels like some of the speakers were mentioning that he's humiliated, because he controls the media, he controls the message, and it's up one day, down the next. I mean, I think that he's able to shape public opinion quite effectively, but we're seeing that mothers who have young conscripts who are going to be called up are really protesting and are very unhappy about this situation. So I think they're trying to show that this is the new norm. This is a new normal for Russia, that, okay, yes, some Russian territory has people in it from Ukraine, but nothing to see here, folks, don't worry about it. I think they're trying to shape public opinion very carefully, and they're very talented at doing that in Russia. Nevertheless, some of the stories will get out from relatives or people who are very unhappy with the situation with their own children.
Finally, to you, Hanna, a lot of the weaponry that's been used in the Kursk region is NATO and US weaponry. So far, those allies are not saying anything. Are people in Ukraine worried that some of the Western partners might start getting uneasy about these operations using NATO weaponry?
Not about that weaponry that's used now, because we already heard the statements from Berlin, London, and Washington that as soon as these weapons are with Ukraine and used according to the previously reached agreements, that's okay. Our problem of using the Western weapons against Russia is only with the long-range missiles such as ATACMS. So for this and Storm Shadow, that's where we still have limitations, and here these limitations were supported. Partially, this operation was necessary because the long-range strikes against the Russian airfields or other military objects at the Russian territory was prohibited for Ukraine. And you understand, when Russian airplanes daily are fighting with the bombs, not even crossing the Ukrainian territory, that's make everything very dangerous. So in this case, as for now, our partners are absolutely okay. As soon as they don't see any war crimes, and luckily for the 2.5 years, Ukrainians didn't do any war crimes. And the second is, as soon as we are not using long-range missiles further than the currently occupied territories.
Thank you, Hanna, and thanks to all our guests today joining us, Theresa Fallon, Hanna Shelest and Owen Matthews. Coverage of the conflict continues on Al Jazeera around the clock. We have teams in Russia and in Ukraine. You'll find full analysis too on aljazeera.com. We, as ever, welcome your comments, thoughts and suggestions. Post them on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or find us on X, where our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and the team in Doha, please stay safe. I'll see you again right here very soon. Bye-bye.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.